Welcome everyone to Shaping Guelph, Developing Growth Scenarios. This is our town hall for this process. So we welcome you to join us tonight. Natalie, if you want to go to the next slide, that would be great.
Susan, we're not seeing a live feed on Facebook yet. Can we just give it one more minute?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, we have confirmation that it's live.
Okay. Great. So welcome everyone to our town hall for Shaping Guelph, Developing Growth Scenarios. Next slide, please. If you are joining us, I see a few folks on the WebEx. That's great. Hopefully some are also following along on the Facebook feed and the city's website. We look forward to your participation in our meeting tonight, and have other avenues for you to share your feedback through Have Your Say as well that we'll review at the end. Before we formally begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So on behalf of the City of Guelph, we acknowledge the lands on which we meet. So as we gather, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people today. As a city, we have a responsibility for the stewardship of the land on which we live and work. And today we acknowledge the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe people on whose traditional territory we are meeting. So for our agenda tonight, we wanted to share information about Shaping Guelph, and what the developing growth scenarios are being considered. We'd like to start with a recap of the provincial policy requirements for Guelph, and then talk about the growth management strategy overview, share the first growth scenario, and then solicit some ideas about alternative growth scenarios before we wrap up and have next steps at 8 o'clock. So for those of you joining us in the WebEx, you're muted now. We will have an opportunity to answer some questions and answers a little bit later in the session. You're welcome to type those into the Q&A bar. It's down on the bottom right. So if you have questions of the team, we'll be happy to get to those once we're through the presentation. And we may have an opportunity as well to have you raise your hand and hear from some of you to ask any questions that you may have. So before we jump into the recap, Natalie, just wanted to do a quick introduction of our team who are on the line tonight, and I'll just have each of you wave if that's okay. So I'm going to start with Natalie Goss. She's the Senior Policy Planner at the City of Guelph, and she will be a presenter tonight. Melissa Adalnate, Manager Policy Planning and Urban Design. Jason Downham, Planner. And Krista Waki, General Manager, Planning and Building Services and Chief Planner. We have Patty Kennedy from Dillon Consulting. Patty will also be presenting tonight. And then James Knott from Lura, who will be helping with facilitation. And Michelle Diplock from Lura Consulting. And again, my name's Susan Hall, and I'll be your moderator from Lura tonight. As I mentioned, the presentations we're hoping will be about half an hour, and that we'll have some time for those questions towards the end before we wrap up and have next steps at 7:45 and close out the meeting at 8. So with that, I think I will pass it to Natalie and we can start the presentations.
Thank you, Susan. Land use planning in Ontario starts with the province. The Planning Act sets out laws for the tools that the city can use to plan Guelph. Tools like an official plan, zoning bylaws, plans of subdivision, and site plans. The next level of planning in Ontario is provincial policies, and the first is a provincial policy statement. And the PPS provides high-level policy direction for the entire province on priorities and things that cities need to consider as they plan. The Provincial Growth Plan is another set of policies that apply specifically to an area of Ontario called the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And the Growth Plan sets out a framework for how this area should grow. And then we get into the local level planning tools. The first being a municipal official plan. And an official plan establishes a vision for growth. It establishes land uses for every property in the city and policies for many items that help to shape our city, its urban design, transportation routes, parks, natural areas, and cultural heritage resources, to name a few. We end with the final tool that we have, which is a zoning bylaw. And a zoning bylaw establishes rules for every property in the city. It tells each property owner how they can use their property, how tall and wide buildings can be, and how tall or how wide lots can be, and how much parking is required on each lot. In 2019, the province issued a new growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. The growth plan manages growth and development throughout the Greater Golden Horseshoe. It sets out population and employment forecasts that Guelph is required to plan for. It also sets out other targets for certain amounts of new residential units that we have to plan for in our already developed areas, and targets for our newly planned areas, like the Clare Maltby area and the Guelph Innovation District. Guelph is part of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, an area of southwestern Ontario that is expected to grow to 15 million people by 2051. Although most of this growth is still expected to be in the Greater Toronto Area, municipalities in the outer ring, so those municipalities that surround the Greater Toronto Area, will experience a greater share of growth to 2051. Guelph is almost completely surrounded by prime agricultural areas and provincially protected natural areas. There are rules for these lands that protect their current agricultural use or natural heritage uses and make expanding our boundaries challenging. The growth plan requires that Guelph plan for a population increase of about 55,800 people over the next 30 years. Our target population is 203,000 people in 2051. Guelph is also required to plan for an increase in its employment base of about 33,300 jobs over the next 30 years. Our target employment base is 116,000 jobs in 2051. Half of new residential units that are constructed in Guelph must be within our already developed areas. And the map on this slide shows our already developed areas, or a built-up area, in yellow. The built-up area was the limit of our developed area in 2006. We must also have a plan for our downtown to accommodate 150 persons and jobs per hectare by 2031. We must also plan for new areas of Guelph, such as Clare Maltby, to have a minimum of 50 persons and jobs per hectare. We are required to update our official plan to conform with the growth plan by July of 2022. The growth plan has identified Guelph's Central Station downtown as a major transit station. And through shaping Guelph, we will need to identify the boundaries of this major transit station area. We are asking for your input on which lands within 500 to 800 meters should be considered as part of Guelph's major transit station area. You can provide your input through the survey that is now live on haveyoursay.guelph.ca. Shaping Guelph is fundamentally a land use study. It looks at our supply of land to 2051. Through these background studies listed on this slide, we will explore where opportunities exist to accommodate more housing in our already developed area, how we can meet the minimum targets and forecasts of the growth plan, and what our housing supply should and needs to be for the next 30 years. We will also look at whether we have enough employment lands and whether they are the right type of employment lands for the jobs that we expect to have over the next 30 years. We will also look at how we can grow to a population of 203,000 people and create 116,000 jobs in a way that works for Guelph. The Shaping Guelph process began earlier this year. In February, we launched this project at a speaker event. We heard from Jennifer Keesmaat, Pamela Robinson, and our former chief planner, Todd Salter. And they shared with us Guelph's growth story and things that we should consider as we plan for growth over the next 30 years. We asked our community what was important to consider as we grow. We took that input and drafted a vision and principles for growth. In August and September, we had conversations with our community about where we should grow and how we should grow in our built-up area. And that brings us to today, conversations with our community about different ways that we can grow. And these different ways are called growth scenarios. Tonight, we'll give you an overview of what growth scenarios are and how you can help shape them. Based on community input, Council endorsed a draft vision and principles for growth in June of this year. And some highlights of those vision and principles include compact and connected and complete city, continuing our environment first approach, having a city that has safe and connected transportation choices, and having a city that has a range and mix of housing that is accessible and affordable. In August and September, we had conversations with the community through a town hall meeting similar to this one and online about where and how Guelph should grow. What we heard was that more housing should be added within our built-up area rather than expanding city boundaries. We heard that the community generally preferred adding more housing downtown, but they also noted that it was important to balance growth across nodes and corridors. We heard that within nodes and corridors and throughout neighborhoods in the built-up area, there was a preference to maintain existing permitted building heights. There was support for increasing densities throughout the built-up area through gentle intensification. For downtown, we had some mixed views on what maximum building heights should be. There was a slight preference for going taller, but the preference for maintaining current height permissions was also strong. Whatever way Guelph grows to 2051, our community reiterated that it was important to maintain our cultural heritage, our character, and our green spaces. The growth scenario process looks at different ways that Guelph can accommodate its population and employment growth to 2051. It will answer questions such as, do we have enough land within our city limits for our projected growth to 2051? Are there enough places in our already developed areas to accommodate half of our growth? Shaping Guelph is focused on our land supply. At the same time, as we are looking at our land supply, many master plans are underway that are looking at the infrastructure that we need to support this growth. Do we have enough water supply? Is there capacity in our wastewater treatment system to service this growth? What, if anything, do we need to change about our road network or our water and wastewater sewer pipes to respond to this growth? We are just starting to look at different growth scenarios, our supply of land. And tonight, Patty will give you an overview of growth scenario 1, and we will start the conversation about different growth scenarios that could be explored. And I'll now turn the presentation over to Patty.
Thank you, Natalie. Good evening, everyone. Before we dive into an examination of growth scenario 1, I think it's helpful for us to spend a bit of time talking about history and what the historic growth trends have been. There are a lot of facts, figures, and numbers, and I think if we ground them a little bit in the historic context, it'll be helpful for us, for all of you watching, to sort of understand what some of the new numbers may mean in the context of history. So let's go to the next slide. So Guelph's population growth, Guelph has grown at a fairly steady rate of growth over the last 20 odd years. Between 2001 and 2021, cities added about 36,800 people and close to 17,000 households. This translates into an average annual growth of about 1,840 people or 840 households. And that works out to about 1.5% growth year over year. For context, the broader Greater Golden Horseshoe grew at a pace of about 1.6% during that same period of time from a population growth perspective. So the city was growing at a relatively similar pace as all the communities combined in and around the Greater Golden Horseshoe. What's interesting to note is while the pace of growth has been fairly steady over that historic period of about 20 odd years, we would note that the way growth has occurred in Guelph has changed over time. This chart shows the proportion of new development in sort of 5-year increments, and it shows that in the early part of the 21st century, we saw a more predominant form of housing being singles and semi-detached dwellings, that representing about 47%. And if we fast forward ahead to the last 4 or 5 years, you'll note a bit of a dramatic shift where we now have almost close to 50% of that development occurring in higher density forms of housing, be it apartment, and another 17% in what we call accessory apartments. The location of new housing units between 2006 and 2019 was relatively split even, with 51% of that development happening in the designated greenfield areas and 49% happening in our built-up area. For context, the current official plan's intensification target is 40%, and that was based on the provincial intensification targets at the time of conformity. So the historic experience has been that the city has managed to exceed its intensification target by about 9% over that period of time. From an employment perspective, the growth has been relatively stable and with steady incremental growth over the 2006 to 2016 period, adding just over 10,000 odd jobs. If this bar chart was up to 2019, I suspect we would see a slightly higher figure than 80,300, but due to some of the adjustments we expected to experience as a result of COVID and some of the employment adjustments, our land economist Watson Associates estimated the 2020 employment level to be 76,800. So let's talk a little bit about growth scenario 1. So the whole purpose of this first scenario is to really operate as a bit of a base case, a way for us to examine how well the city's current policy framework can implement the province's new population employment forecasts assigned to Guelph, as well as the new intensification and density targets assigned to the city. So I'm going to walk through a series of assumptions and provide a little bit of context for those assumptions around this first scenario. So from a population perspective, the plan for this scenario is to plan for a population of 203,000 to 2051 and to maintain a relatively steady average growth rate of about 1.5%. So that maintains the sort of historic average growth rate over the time horizon. This diagram here shows some nuances in that the pace of growth through the forecast period will be a little bit faster between 2021 and 2031 and slowing a little bit in the back end of the forecast. Over this period, we would be adding 55,800 people and 26,000 housing units. Second key assumption for this scenario is that we would be planning for an intensification target of 50% of all the new housing units to be located in the built-up area, which represents the minimum intensification target for the city through the growth plan, and that we'd also maintain the 150 people and jobs per hectare density target in the downtown urban growth center. The third key assumption is that growth continues to be directed to downtown and along our existing nodes and corridors with opportunities for growth throughout the built-up area. So what you see here on your screen is a map of the existing city, and you see three colors here, the beige color being our designated greenfield area, the built-up area in purple, which includes our downtown urban growth center in pink in the center. 50% of the future growth in this scenario would be accommodated in the built-up area, so that represents approximately 11,900 units between 2022 and 2051. In order to understand how well the built-up area could accommodate this amount of growth, we undertook a supply analysis of the existing built-up area. We use the official plan to understand what the physical potential for intensification could be across the built-up area by looking at the maximum heights and densities from the official plan, as well as by looking at the existing secondary plans for the downtown and the Guelph Innovation District. One of the key assumptions in this analysis was to maximize the growth potential in these areas to their maximum permissions in the official plan. So what you see on the screen now is an extra layer of information showing the designated nodes and corridors that are in the official plan. These are key areas within the city that are either planned for mixed use development or further intensification already. And they also have a series of planned densities and permissions that are intended to encourage further growth and intensification in these areas. I will not be going through this slide in too much detail, but it is here for those of you who are curious to know what are some of the differences in the designations in the official plan. And you may be wondering what some of the height permissions are. There is a range by the different designations across the built-up area, ranging from a 2-story minimum up to a maximum of 10 stories in the mixed-use, commercial mixed-use nodes. And the downtown secondary plan area where is the place where we can accommodate the tallest uses and typically one would expect also the most densest uses. For context, the numbers I know can be a little bit much unless you are a bit of a planning junkie and have your head around what units per hectare and people and jobs per hectare look like. So I do have a few slides to illustrate at the site level anyway what some of these different either built form or densities look like. So on your screen here for context, you see a medium density townhome development built out at 100 person and jobs per hectare or 40 units per hectare. And below is a low-rise apartment, which is represents approximately 90 units per hectare or 150 people and jobs per hectare. In the downtown context, as I mentioned, is where we see some of our tallest and densest uses, and this is a high-rise mixed-use apartment structure with 400 units per hectare and approximately 700 people and jobs per hectare. So in examining the overall supply and the existing plan permissions across the built-up area, the initial conclusion is that yes, we can accommodate that intensification target of 50%, and we do have a sufficient supply to do so. At full build-out, it's interesting to note that if we were to maximize all the potential on all those sites, we could accommodate just under 200,000 people across the built-up area. I will be mentioning this perhaps later as well. This does assume that all those sites have to be built out to their maximum potential. So assumption 4 is that the range and mix of housing options will be there to support our housing stock. So let's take a look at what that mix looks like. Over time, the expectation is that we will, as we do attract a greater diversity of housing types, that we will influence the overall housing mix in the city. So you see the present day overall mix, which is 53% low density, 21% medium density, and 26% high density. Through the intensification policies and framework, the housing mix at the outcome of this scenario would look something more like 39% low density, 21% medium density, and 40% high density. From a greenfield perspective, we do have a couple of key areas to speak about: the planned land uses and densities and heights in the Guelph Innovation District and the council endorsed preferred community structure for Clare-Monkey. Let's talk about those areas in a little more detail as they represent significant opportunities for future growth in our greenfield areas. So on this slide, we see the built-up area in a little more detail. Excuse me, we see the greenfield area in a little more detail. In blue are the employment areas, and in green are the community areas. Approximately half of the designated greenfield area is vacant, and just under half is already developed, with about 4% in process of being developed. So not all these areas are equal in terms of density, and what we actually see now in the DGA, in the designated greenfield area on our existing developed lands, is a variety of different densities across the DGA. Now, how do we get such different densities in different locations? It's because there's a different typology and different built form in some of these areas. And so places that have a broader diversity of uses, where they're a mix of medium density, low density, and higher density, we can expect to see higher DGA targets. And these are some examples of some recent forms of both stacked townhouses and high density apartments. So this table is an overview of the opportunities within the DGA. What it shows is that between the Clare Maltby Secondary Plan, the Guelph Innovation District, and other vacant DGAs, we have the potential we add up to about 497 hectares of land within the designated greenfield area that can accommodate approximately 13,440 new housing units and 6,020 potential jobs. From an employment perspective, we are planning for employment growth, an employment base of 116,000 jobs by 2051. And the employment forecast illustrates a relatively steady pace of growth over that period, adding up to potential growth of around 33,300 jobs over the forecast period. The approximate breakdown of employment is what we call population-related employment, representing about 53%. That's the portion of employment that's tied directly to our population growth. We typically think of this form of development and employment as your shopping and service-related commercial type uses. Employment land employment represents the next largest chunk at 31%. These are represent a category of employment jobs located on our designated employment land. So if you think back to the slide earlier where we showed the blue areas in the greenfield locations, that would represent an approximation of a portion of our employment land in our greenfield areas. And major office represents 17%. So a key assumption here, assumption number 7, is that the existing and planned employment densities within the Guelph Innovation District Secondary Plan will remain in place, and that the lands proposed to change from employment to residential as per the council endorsed community preferred structure for Clare Maltby Secondary Plan occur. So these employment land conversions you see on this map at the south end, the Clare Maltby conversion area, as well as a smaller conversion area up on York Road at the eastern edge of the city. These two employment areas would come out of our supply and be converted to another use. And what you see on the rest of the map is the designated employment areas where that employment growth would be accommodated. So let's talk a little bit about, now I've gone through quite a bit of detail, let's speak a little bit about what this all means and what sort of the conclusions are around scenario 1. So there is enough urban land within the city to accommodate the forecast population employment growth to 2051 under this scenario. We are able to achieve the 50% intensification target within our built-up area. And both the secondary plans within the GID and Clare Maltby plan densities are critical to achieving the 50 people and jobs per hectare density target for the DGA. Within the built-up area, as I mentioned, we do have a sufficient supply to accommodate that intensification target. The key caveat here is it does require a number of sites to be built out to their maximum heights and densities From a current market demand perspective, we're not sure if this is necessarily a reasonable assumption, so there's a need for us to do some further work on that to understand how well this supply is able to accommodate the target from a pure market perspective. From a designated greenfield perspective, we do have sufficient land to accommodate the population and community employment growth for the DGA, but it does place a heavy reliance on those established DGA areas, and most of the DGA is expected to be built out by 2051 under this scenario. From an employment lands perspective, we do also have a sufficient supply of employment lands to accommodate the employment growth to 2051. There is a reliance on the GID district densities, which are achievable, but the expectation is that it will take some time because they tend to be higher densities in that area. And that employment growth through intensification is also an important part of achieving the forecast. So I'm going to pass the ball over to Susan for the moment, as maybe we'll take a few questions on scenario 1.
Great, thanks, Patty. That was a lot of information and right on time. So thank you both, Natalie and Patty, for that. I just want to remind those on the WebEx event that you can use the question and answer function if there's things that you think of. Those of you watching through Facebook, you can also add some questions in the Facebook feed and we'll try to address them. And we can also, for those in the WebEx, if you want to raise your hand, we can unmute and you can ask your question. I'll just ask that you raise your hand and then I will direct who we'll hear from. And any questions, we're going to try to keep them short just so we can get through as many as possible. And if we don't get through them all, we will post the questions and answers on the Have Your Say site so people can get the responses there. James, I'm going to turn it to you to see what questions we've had come in.
Yep, we have a question on Facebook, but before I read that, I just want to let Todd know. Todd's here in WebEx. Todd typed a question in, but it got cut off. So if you could either please round out your answer or raise your hand and we'll get to you. Our first question comes from Facebook, and it asks, how about an affordable grocery store? So I may ask the team to speak to the provision of that, but maybe also talk about the commercial uses, how they're accounted for, and affordability in general.
I can take a stab at answering that question, and Natalie, you may want to jump in afterwards if there's some other angles to it. So in a long-range planning exercise like this, a key outcome or a key next step would be to estimate the commercial needs for the city in sort of a future exercise and figure out how much floor space for grocery stores and population-related services would be needed. In this type of project, we don't actually get down into the details, but ensuring we have a sufficient amount of commercial lands is a key kind of consideration in a future exercise. Natalie, I don't know if you want to add a little bit more to that about how a planning exercise like this would handle something very specific like an affordable grocery store.
Sure, Patty, thank you. The city recently completed a commercial policy review, which was implemented in our official plan through an amendment earlier this year. And that commercial policy review looked at our supply of commercial land and made some recommendations on additional areas that we could add to the city from an official plan land use perspective to increase our supply and our range of commercial land. And that's what was implemented earlier this year. So that study indicated that through some changes to our official plan, which are now in place, we have sufficient supply available for our commercial land base to 2031 as well as 2041.
Okay, great. Thanks, Natalie. James, through the chat, I don't know if Todd, you got to finish your question?
Oh, it looks like he has.
Okay,
now.
great.
So Todd asks, good evening. I'm new to Guelph. I have lived in and pondered how other world cities grow and mature. Guelph has strong urban design character, an ecological benefit with the parklands and river corridors, and a good vibe. How are we moving towards a city that is growing for people scale and passive transportation, not designing for the private automobile? So many of the outer suburbs depend on cars for even small trips. Thank you for your work, Todd.
Okay. So I think a couple of things to say there. It's a good question. One of the best things cities can do in terms of having a plan for growth is to identify a preferred structure of how they want to organize their city. In the case of Guelph, there is a defined series of nodes and corridors in the current official plan. The idea is that nodes and corridors, as the city grows over time, they become more mature. They become opportunities to attract density, and through density, we can support other modes and vehicles, such as vehicles of transportation, such as transit. So it's actually crucial that we have a system of nodes and corridors that supports transit to reduce congestion and allow people other options for transportation to move around and through the city. And so one of the interesting questions of this OP review is to think about that current structure, and is it going to get us where we need to be in 2051, or do we need to make alterations, add new nodes and corridors, try to improve connectivity? These are all important questions we'll have to grapple with the OP review.
Great, thanks, Patty. James, any others?
Yeah, we had a couple comments on Facebook. One comment said, keep it green. So I'm going to turn that to a question and ask the team, what are the plans to keep the city green?
Okay, well, I will start, but others should feel free to chime in. The city's current plan identifies both. We spent most of tonight talking about places to grow, but you may recall at the outset, Natalie spoke a bit about the sort of the structure, the green structure for the city and the agricultural lands around the city. So these are the places to not grow. These are the places that we want to preserve and protect from development. And so there is a green spine in the current official plan that identifies the natural heritage system within the city, has policies to protect those areas and enhance them as over time. So that's a key component to sort of keep it green. It would be to identify the places that you want to protect. There's a whole bunch of other things one could say, but I'll maybe stop there and let others chime in.
Great, thanks, Patty. Melissa, did you want to add anything to that one?
Sure, thank you. I would just add, in addition to our natural heritage system policies, and I would just add that our official plan is an environment first plan. So we protected our natural heritage system prior to beginning planning for growth. So that area has been protected. And in addition to the work that we're doing in planning, our city partners are also working on an urban forest management plan and looking at our tree canopy cover and how we can improve that in the future. So it is coordinated, and we are focused on keeping the city green.
Okay, great. And just checking to see if there's any more. Looks like there might be another one, James.
Yeah, we have one in WebEx and one from Facebook. I'll go to the WebEx first.
Okay.
Is transportation planning in terms of considering a more intensive form of public transit, such as an Is transportation planning in terms of considering a more intensive form of public transit, such as an LRT, being considered?
Might kick this back to Melissa to answer perhaps at this time. That's okay.
Thanks. Currently, the city is undertaking a transportation master plan, and that's where they're considering how we shift our modes away from private automobiles. So I would suggest looking on the city's website for information about the transportation master plan. As far as our current structure, we aren't looking at an LRT, but we are looking at other methods for changing our mode shares to support transit and active transportation.
Great, thanks, Melissa. It looks like there's a couple others coming in.
Yeah, from Facebook, we have, how is the existing and future municipal infrastructure analyzed with the proposed densities? Are there areas of the city that require more expensive infrastructure to develop than others? And how is this factored into your growth analysis?
Okay, so that's a very good question. It's very top of mind. The city is in the process of updating its infrastructure master plans. We are on the cusp of beginning to take a look at the implications of where available capacity is for growth within the city and try to matching it up with where our supply opportunities are. So that's a crucial next step, and it's part of our evaluation of scenarios, is to understand where the infrastructure gaps are and what the implications for growth at sort of the next level down.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patty. And I think there's one more.
Yes, there's another in WebEx. Currently, the framework for Clare Maltby has a broader range of densities for various land uses, low, medium, high. Will those density targets be increased or tightened in order to meet the required targets?
Well, certainly in scenario one, we have not assumed any changes to those density targets, and that was, you'll recall, we were speaking towards the importance of those current density targets in helping us achieve the overall average of at least 50 people and jobs per hectare. Certainly in the examination of alternatives, it's welcome for people to provide input on what assumptions we should be considering in other scenarios.
Okay. There's one or two more, and then Patty, I'll get you to talk about sort of what the alternative scenarios process will be.
Great. Our next question is, I would love to know the precedent cities that you all like and that you see Guelph growing like.
Ooh, that's a good one. So I suppose for me, I'm originally from Quebec City. That's where I grew up. It's a city of about, while scale, it's quite a bit larger, probably 2.5 times larger than Guelph. I've always found it to be a city that works really well from all the competing interests that city planning has to deal with. One that values its heritage and its history. It has a really good bus network that allows you to move around through the city. It seems to have really good connection of corridors and green spaces and like all the things one would want. But I would admit to being a little bit partial to that because that's where I grew up. Others may wish to chime in.
Any others? They're smiling, so I think that we'll leave it there. There was a question just about what the term gentle density means. It was used earlier in the presentation tonight. So Patty, maybe you could explain that one.
Sure. This is a term meant to describe how within an established neighborhood, if you would imagine an existing lower density neighborhood, the term intensification may not marry well with that. You may think, it's lower density, it's singles, it's semis. There may be potential in these neighborhoods to have some townhomes, 3-story walk-up apartment, something that is very gentle, and that's why the term is meant, because it's almost not that it's invisible, but it actually respects kind of the character of the neighborhood, but it's a different built form, and it tends to sort of not overwhelm the neighborhood in terms of going with height. Instead, you find other ways to get a bit of density, so that's why it's meant to describe that kind of phenomena where you get some intensification in a more traditional lower rise neighborhood.
Okay, great. James, time for maybe one more, and then we'll go over the alternative.
Yep, the last question asks, can you please explain briefly what scenario 1 is?
Scenario 1 is, in a nutshell, it is using the existing official plan, policy, structure, and framework to accommodate the province's new growth targets and density targets. In a nutshell, in 2 seconds.
Thanks, Patty. And the bulk of the presentation provided sort of the assumptions that you used to go into that scenario 1. And we're welcoming your feedback on that. I think, Natalie, if you could go back to the slides, then I'll just ask Patty to cover off the development of the alternative scenarios, please.
Okay, so let's go to Okay, so in thinking about, this was the scenario one, and sort of a more of our base case type scenario. In thinking about additional scenarios, there are some parameters around that. The parameters being some things maybe we can't change at this point, which is that we have a fixed urban boundary, so we need to maximize the use of land within the urban boundary we have. The amount of growth that we're going to plan for to 2051, that 203,000 people and equivalent on the job side is something that we're considering at this time being fixed. The planning for half of the new housing units in the built-up area, so that intensification target, the minimum is fixed at 50%. The densities in the GID and Clare multi-plan areas, these are required to achieve the minimums, so the expectation is they're not likely to decrease or change in our future scenarios. And certainly the minimum density target in the downtown of 150 people and jobs per hectare is also not expected to change. Some things that we can change, or things to think about, I guess, in terms of what another scenario or alternative scenario might look like, would be an alternative intensification target. So perhaps directing more than 50% of housing to the built-up area. We could consider directing more growth to specific nodes and corridors through increased heights and densities. So recall back, we had that slide with the different heights and densities by the different designations. We could consider picking a couple of corridors and concentrating development there and increasing permissions. Could also consider adding new nodes and corridors. Some of the questions this evening about modes of transportation and alternative modes for transportation. Are there nodes and corridors that we should add for connectivity reasons that over 30 years may also have potential for intensification? One of the things to think about when thinking about new nodes and corridors is that presumably the city will still exist beyond 2051. So, you really do have to take a really long view when planning city structure, and there's nothing wrong with laying a foundation well before the market is ready. We could also consider a different mix of housing, as well as we consider a different pace of growth for designated greenfield areas. You'll recall I mentioned that the DGA would be mostly built out by 2051. So if we go with higher intensification rates, it may produce a different pace of development in the DGA, as well as different densities for our employment lands.
Okay, great. Maybe, Natalie, we can just leave that last slide up if you don't mind. Patty, I think we had one before we see if there's any questions about developing sort of two additional scenarios. There was, I think, one more that came in through Facebook, James.
Yeah, it was a follow-up from our gentle density question. The person asked, would you consider the 772 Paisley Road 4-story apartment buildings to be gentle density in their area?
We'll defer to perhaps city staff to answer that question. I don't know if Natalie or
Sure, I can take that. I don't have their actual designation at my fingertips right now, but those sites were planned for higher density apartment. So they wouldn't be considered gentle density. They were planned as apartment sites.
Okay, great. Thanks, Melissa. Natalie, maybe just put the previous slide up. So we're asking just if there's any questions. So Patty and the city will be looking at additional scenarios. So we spent quite a bit of time sharing sort of that first scenario and the I think it was 8 assumptions that went into its development. And they're looking for thoughts on considerations that can change and the creation of sort of 2 more scenarios. So any questions from those in the meeting or on Facebook about the creation of the other 2 scenarios?
We have one question here from the meeting.
Okay.
What are the city's assumptions on housing typology preferences in the market? could it be more build sustainable and people will buy it rather than build single family housing as default no matter what?
So I think in this particular scenario, well, at least in our first scenario, our base case, we are imagining an evolution. In fact, the historic data, look at the building permits over the last decade, we are seeing a shift in market preference that isn't necessarily single detached, low density predominated. In fact, seem to be moving in a direction with a greater diversity of housing typologies. I'm not going to quote the stats here. You probably had enough of numbers for tonight, but certainly in the slide deck, there's some graphs and illustrations that sort of demarcate that evolution, and that's a key assumption and a key trend that we expect to see continue through our scenarios.
Great, thanks, Patty. I'm just looking to see any others coming in, James.
Yes, we have one more.
Okay.
Will you be using a market-based approach? The market has been demanding ground-related dwelling. Why is this not reflected in the planning?
Okay. Yes, we will use a market-based approach. We have used the market-based approach to date so far. Watson and Associates is our partner in this, and they spent a lot of time looking at the historic demand trends and the growth drivers on both the population side, the demographics, socioeconomic, and the housing market, and that's what's underpinning the projected housing mix. But certainly open for feedback when we have our technical studies published and out there. We'll be doing more engagement on that, and looking forward to hearing any feedback we get on those, on our insights on the market and any insights others have on where the market's headed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patty. Any others, James? Questions?
Yes. We have a comment. It just states, generally the typology has changed from single family dwellings because there has been no single family homes in Guelph since 2010.
Okay. Great. I'm not seeing any others coming in through Facebook either. James, Jason?
No.
Okay. Great. I think then what I'll do, if there's no other questions from those in the meeting, we encourage you to still participate and have your say, because we have a survey that you can help shape what those scenarios include and give us further feedback there. If you've got additional questions that you think of after the meeting today, you're welcome to include them there. Natalie, last words on next steps and where it goes from here.
Sure, thank you, Susan. So thank you everybody for participating in our conversation this evening. We have launched a survey on haveyoursay.guelph.ca that will be up until December the 18th, where we provide some shortened version of this presentation tonight, so you have the context on the overview for scenario 1 and to provide some input and your reactions on that. And then ask for your suggestions on what alternative growth scenarios we should be exploring before we undertake that work. The input that we receive from this round of community engagement will be used directly to inform, together with our own thoughts and our consultants' thoughts on what 2 growth scenarios should be explored in addition to the one that we shared this evening. And ultimately that work will make its way into 3 growth scenarios, which will be presented for community input early in 2021. And moving from there, as we showed you earlier this evening on how we develop growth scenarios, we'll move into a preferred growth scenario being selected and a local growth management strategy being developed for Guelph that will guide our growth and development for the next 30 years. I'll pass it back to you, Susan.
Sure. Okay. So Thanks, Natalie and Patty, for your presentations tonight. And for those of you who joined us through WebEx or through Facebook or watched through the city's live feed, again, you're welcome to share your views on Have Your Say and provide further input there. And I just wanted to say thank you for your time and have a great evening.